I could hear my mother crying. Not for me. For my sister. "Madison, look at me, baby. Stay with me." The passenger side of the car had folded around my body like a fist. My left leg was trapped somewhere beneath the dashboard. My shoulder was jammed against the door, and every breath pulled the seatbelt tighter across my ribs. I could smell burned rubber, hot metal, and the bitter chemical dust from the airbags. "Mom." She didn't turn. "Mom, please." Outside the shattered rear window, my father was trying to pull Madison free. A man who had stopped on the highway was helping him. Madison was crying, blood running down the side of her face. "I can't move," I said. Nobody answered. "Dad." He looked at me once. That was the part I remembered most clearly afterward. Not the pain. Not the glass. His face. He saw that I was conscious. He saw that I was trapped. Then, he turned back toward Madison. "She's bleeding more," he said. My mother climbed halfway into the rear of the car, grabbed Madison beneath the arms, and screamed at my father to pull. I started fighting the seatbelt. "Dad, please help me." A second driver had stopped. Someone was shouting that emergency crews were on the way. Someone else said Madison needed a hospital. My mother looked at me. For one stupid second, relief flooded through me. I thought she was coming back. Instead, she said, "Rachel's awake. She can hold on." Then she took Madison's hand. "Save her first." They got my sister into the back seat of a stranger's SUV. My father hesitated beside our wrecked car. "Dad." He rubbed both hands over his face. "Please don't leave me here." He looked toward the SUV. Then toward me. "You're strong, Rachel." I wish I could say I shouted something brave. I didn't. I begged. "Please." He closed what was left of the rear door. Then both my parents drove away with my sister. I watched the SUV disappear between the flashing hazard lights of the cars stopped along the highway. I was 30 years old, trapped in twisted metal, and the thought that came into my head was so ugly that I never admitted it to anyone afterward. If I died before the ambulance came, would they turn around? I didn't die. Emergency crews cut me out 23 minutes later, but for the next 10 years, whenever my parents called me strong, I heard what they had really meant. You can survive being left. 10 years later, they showed up at my front door, expecting me to prove it again. At 40, I made my living finding the sentence nobody else wanted to read. I was a nonprofit risk and compliance consultant, which sounded dull enough that most of my relatives stopped asking questions after the word compliance. My clients hired me when grant reports didn't match source records, when policies said one thing and people did another, or when an executive insisted a problem was just wording. Wording was rarely just wording. That Thursday morning, I was sitting at my dining table with 2 screens open, checking whether a healthcare nonprofit's reported transportation outcomes matched its supporting invoices, when my doorbell rang. I glanced at the clock. Shirdian Shasifen. Nobody was scheduled. The bell rang again. Then a third time. I crossed the limestone floor and looked through the narrow pane beside the front door. My mother stood on the porch, holding a leather folder against her chest. My father was beside her. Madison stood one step behind them. For a moment, I simply stared. They had been inside my villa only twice in 6 years. Once when I first bought it, back when half the kitchen cabinets were missing and the roof still leaked over the upstairs landing. Once after I finished the major renovations, when my mother walked through the living room and said, 3 bedrooms for 1 person seems excessive. I had laughed then. I didn't now. I opened the door but left my hand on it. "Why are you here?" My mother smiled too quickly. "Hello to you too." "Mom." Madison looked thinner than the last time I had seen her. Her blonde hair was pulled into a low knot, and the skin beneath her eyes was gray with exhaustion. Dad cleared his throat. "Can we come in?" I should have said no immediately. Instead, habit moved faster than judgment. I stepped backward. All 3 of them entered the foyer. My mother looked past me toward the living room. That was when I noticed I had moved aside for them without thinking. The realization irritated me more than it should have. I took 1 step forward again, not enough to force anyone out. Enough to stop making space automatically. "What happened?" Madison folded her arms. "My lease ends in 3 weeks. I looked at her. "And?" Her jaw tightened. Mom answered for her. "The divorce has been harder than expected." Madison's husband had filed 7 months earlier. I knew that much. We weren't close, but we exchanged birthday texts and the occasional strained holiday message. The settlement still isn't finalized, Mom continued. Her rent increased. She needs somewhere stable. I waited. My father glanced around the foyer. You've got plenty of room. There it was. I looked at Madison. Are you asking to move in? She opened her mouth. Mom spoke first. Temporarily. No. The word came out so quickly that all three of them went still. Mom blinked. You haven't even heard. I heard enough. Rachel. No. Dad exhaled through his nose. Can we at least sit down? No. He stared at me. I pointed toward the porch. If we're discussing who gets to live in my house, we can do it from there. My mother's face changed. Not much. Just enough. That small tightening around her mouth I remembered from childhood whenever I broke the script before she was ready. Don't be ridiculous. I'm not. Madison looked between us. Can everybody just calm down? I am calm. That was true. My pulse had climbed, but my voice had not. Mom hugged the folder tighter. We came because we were trying to handle this like a family. I almost laughed. Instead, I opened the door wider. Porch. Dad muttered something under his breath, but they stepped outside. I followed and pulled the door nearly closed behind me. No one was going farther into my house until I knew why they were there. My mother looked at me as if I had embarrassed her in public, even though the only audience was a pair of potted citrus trees and my front gate. Madison needs stability, she said. I understand that. You have stability. Yes, you have more than stability. Her eyes moved toward the arched windows behind me. I knew what she saw. A restored Mediterranean villa in a neighborhood where prices had climbed obscenely over the last several years. She didn't see the first winter I lived with plastic sheeting over a broken upstairs window. She didn't see the roof invoices, the plumbing replacement, the insurance premiums, the property tax bills, or the nights I sat on the kitchen floor comparing contractor bids because one mistake could wreck 6 months of cash flow. I bought the villa as a distressed property. I made the down payment myself. I carried the mortgage myself. Every tax bill, every insurance premium, every repair, every renovation payment came from my consultancy income and my accounts. The house was worth around $2 million now. That did not mean anyone had given it to me. My father held out his hand. Elaine. Mom passed him the leather folder. He offered it to me. Read this. I didn't take it. What is it? A family use arrangement. I looked at him. There is no such thing as a family use arrangement that gives you rights to my house. That's not what I said. It's what you're implying. His mouth flattened. Just read it. Madison rubbed both hands over her upper arms. I told them I could find another apartment. Mom turned sharply. That is not the point. Madison stared at her. It literally is the point. No, the point is that your sister has a 3-bedroom house, and you are struggling. And that creates what, exactly? I asked. Mom looked at me. Responsibility. There was the second word my family loved almost as much as strong. Responsibility. In our house, it had never meant everybody carrying their share. It meant whoever was still standing carried what everyone else dropped. Mom took the folder back from Dad and pushed it toward me. You have spent your entire adult life acting as though you did everything alone. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Her voice sharpened. We carried you through the worst year of your life. The highway came back so fast I could smell the airbag dust. I forced myself to stay on the porch. Dad said, Your mother means the recovery period. I know what she means. She's right. I looked at him. He had gone softer around the face over the last decade. More gray in his hair. More careful movements. But his tone was the same one he used when he wanted something unpleasant to sound reasonable. Madison needs the house more than you need all of it. I stared at him. He actually said it. Not a room. Not a few weeks. The house. My sister deserves my house? She deserves stability. So do I. You have it. That doesn't make mine available. Mom shook her head. There. That attitude. What attitude? Everything is yours. Your time is yours. Your money is yours. Your house is yours. I almost smiled. Yes. Madison looked down. Dad rubbed a hand along his jaw. You know what Mom means. No. I know exactly what she said. My mother stepped closer. You would not be standing here if this family had not carried you after the accident. Madison flinched. Not much, but I saw it. I said, do not use the crash to claim my house. I'm not claiming anything. You brought paperwork. Mom's face went smooth again. She had always been better when she remembered to be calm. This foundation has spent 10 years helping people because of what happened to us. To us? All of us. I looked at Madison. She had gone very still. Mom continued. And if you decide to turn this into some ugly public fight because you still resent how emergency decisions were made 10 years ago, people will hear our side too. There it was. Not a legal threat. Something more familiar. A story. Dad picked it up smoothly. You work with nonprofits, Rachel. You know how this looks. My attention shifted to him. How what looks? You have built a career talking about ethics and accountability. Meanwhile, your own sister is going through a divorce. Your mother runs a charity that grew out of helping this family recover, and you're standing in a $2 million house telling everyone to get off your porch. Madison's head snapped toward him. Dad. He ignored her. If Elaine has to explain to the board why her own daughter is attacking the foundation over an old family grievance, she will. My stomach tightened. Not because I believed their version. Because I understood exactly what selective facts could do. I worked in a field built on trust. A rumor would not cost me my career. But a story about a compliance consultant attacking a survivor charity out of bitterness could create questions, awkward client calls, and months of explaining something that should never have existed. Mom watched my face. She saw the moment it landed. That made me colder. You're threatening my reputation to get Madison into my house. Madison said, Mom, I never asked you to do that. Elaine barely looked at her. This is not a threat. It is reality. No, I said. Reality has source documents. Dad's eyes narrowed. This is why nobody can talk to you anymore. Everything becomes an audit. That's because you brought a folder from a foundation lawyer to my front door. Silence. I held out my hand. Give it to me. Mom hesitated, then passed me the folder. I looked at the letterhead. Cole Road Recovery Foundation, reviewed by outside counsel. My pulse slowed instead of speeding up. That happened sometimes when a problem finally became specific. Why is Foundation Counsel reviewing where Madison sleeps? No one answered immediately. I looked at my sister. Did you ask the foundation for housing support? No. Did you ask Mom to involve the board? No. Did you ask for my house? Madison's eyes flicked toward Mom. I asked if you might let me stay for a few weeks. That's not what these papers are about. I haven't seen them. Mom cut in. Madison does not need to understand every administrative detail. Madison turned to her. Why does the foundation care where I stay? Mom's expression hardened. This is not the time. It seems like exactly the time. My sister sounded more confused than angry. Mom ignored her and looked at me. Sign what is appropriate. Help your sister. Stop punishing everyone for something that happened 10 years ago. I opened the folder. The first page was a proposed temporary occupancy arrangement. I scanned the first paragraph. Then the second. Dad said, You don't need to do this now. Yes, I do. Rachel. I closed the folder. Leave. Mom stared at me. What? You came to my house without warning, threatened to turn my professional reputation into a family weapon, and handed me documents Madison hasn't even seen. That is not what happened. It is from where I'm standing, Madison whispered. Mom, let's go. Elaine looked at her. Do you understand what she is doing to you? Madison's face changed. There was pain there. And anger. Some of it for me. But she said, I understand I don't want to do this on her porch. That was enough. Dad stepped toward me. We need an answer by Friday. I looked at him. Why Friday? He said nothing. Mom answered. Because this cannot drag on. That's not an answer. You have the documents. I opened my front door. Then I'll read them. Mom stood still. For once in your life, Rachel, try to remember that being capable does not mean you have to be selfish. I met her eyes. For once in yours, try to remember that capable doesn't mean available. Then I went inside. I closed the door and locked it. For several seconds, I stood with one hand on the deadbolt. My body was back on that highway. 30 years old. Unable to move. Watching my parents disappear with Madison. Except this time my legs worked. This time I had closed the door. I carried the folder to the kitchen island. Before I opened it again, I photographed the cover, the envelope, and every page, in order. Habit. Then, I scanned everything into a folder on my laptop. Cole Family. 8/14. Subfolders. Originals. Correspondence. Timeline. I started reading. The temporary occupancy proposal was irritating but not frightening. It did not magically transfer ownership. It did not create some secret family lien. It was exactly what I expected. An agreement designed to make Madison's stay more formal than a few weeks, with language about family stability and continuing access. I could refuse it. Then I reached page 9. The heading read, Survivor Outcome. Acknowledgement. I read the first paragraph once, then again. I, Rachel Cole, acknowledge that my current long-term residential stability represents a continuation of recovery, support, and survivor housing outcomes facilitated through the Cole Road Recovery Foundation and its affiliated family recovery initiatives. My fingers stopped moving. There were 3 problems in one sentence. Current residential stability. Recovery support. Foundation facilitated housing outcome. I scrolled lower. The acknowledgement referenced historical reporting periods. Not future support. Past reporting. I leaned back. Why would you need this now? No one answered, obviously. But documents often did if you asked them the right way. I checked the footer. Version number. Creation date. Then the metadata embedded in the PDF. 3 days earlier. I opened a blank spreadsheet. Column 1. Document. Column 2. Date. Column 3. Claim. Column 4. Source. Column 5. Contradiction. I typed. Outcome acknowledgement claims current villa linked to foundation-supported long-term housing. Then I opened my property files. Closing statement. Mortgage records. Insurance. Tax receipts. Renovation invoices. I had bought the place 6 years earlier with my own down payment. My mortgage payments came from my account. The property tax bills came to me. The insurance premiums came from me. The roof replacement came from me. The rewiring. The plumbing. The pool resurfacing I regretted for 6 months. All of it. The foundation had never paid a cent toward the villa. I stared again at the acknowledgement. My phone was already in my hand before I decided who to call. Naomi Chen answered on the 4th ring. Tell me this isn't about the transportation grant. It isn't. Good. I hated that grant. Despite myself, I smiled. Naomi and I had worked opposite sides of 2 nonprofit reviews before eventually becoming friends. She had spent years in governance work before opening her own consulting practice. I have a hypothetical. That means it's not hypothetical. If an organization used someone as a long-term outcome example for years and suddenly wanted that person to sign a retroactive acknowledgement, what would make you curious? Naomi was silent for a moment. Then her voice changed. Professional, renewal, audit, grant condition, partner review. Something that finally requires the story to have a source. I looked at the Friday deadline written in Mom's cover letter. What would you do first? Preserve everything exactly as received. Done. Don't accuse anybody yet. I wasn't planning to. Good. Another pause. Rachel? Yeah? Whatever this is, separate what you know from what you think. I looked at my spreadsheet. I always do. After we hung up, I went upstairs to the small cabinet in my office where I kept personal documents I never quite knew what to do with. At the back was a framed newspaper article my mother had mailed me 9 years earlier. I had never hung it. I also had never thrown it away. The headline read, The Family That Turned Tragedy into Hope. There was a photograph of Mom in front of the foundation's first rented office. Madison stood beside her. Dad was behind them. I was not in the picture. That had bothered me once. Now I was grateful. I read the article carefully. Halfway down, I found the phrase, supporting both daughters through long-term recovery and helping create stable paths back to independent living. My stomach tightened. I took the frame downstairs, set it beside the folder. Then I searched the foundation's website. The homepage was polished. Survivor transportation, temporary housing referrals, rehabilitation coordination, return to work assistance, programs that mattered, programs I had never wanted destroyed. I clicked partners. A regional hospital network appeared at the top. I opened the partnership page. Near the bottom was a line I almost missed. Annual partnership renewal review, September cycle, documentation window now open. I checked the date, then the metadata on Mom's packet. The acknowledgement had been created 3 days after the documentation window opened. My phone buzzed. A text from Mom. We need this handled before Friday. Please don't make Madison pay for old pain. I read it twice. Then I went back to the foundation website. Annual reports. I downloaded the most recent one. Search. Rachel. 1 result. My throat went dry. The section heading read, Long-term survivor housing outcomes. The report did not print my street address. It didn't need to. It referred to a founding family survivor achieving permanent, independent residential stability following foundation-supported recovery coordination. Age, year, timeline. There was no doubt who it meant. Me. I sat very still. The house around me made ordinary afternoon sounds. The refrigerator compressor clicked on. Somewhere outside, a landscaping truck reversed with a soft electronic beep. The air conditioning moved through the vents. My house. My mortgage. My taxes. My insurance. My repairs. My life. And my mother's foundation had already turned it into an outcome. I looked at the unsigned acknowledgement on the island. Then at the Friday deadline. That was when the story changed. My parents had not come to put my villa into their narrative. They had already done that. What they needed now was my signature underneath it. And whatever was waiting on the other side of Friday had finally made 10 years of storytelling require proof. For several minutes, the annual report stayed open on my screen, while the same sentence kept rearranging itself in my head. Foundation-supported recovery coordination. It sounded harmless enough. Almost generous. That was the trick with language like that. Nobody had written, we paid Rachel's mortgage. Nobody had claimed the foundation bought my house. The wording sat in the soft space between implication and fact, where a reader could easily assume more than the documents could prove. My mother had spent years living in that space. I closed the report and opened a new file. Before going any further, there was one question I needed answered. Had the foundation ever actually given me housing assistance? Memory was not evidence, even when the memory felt obvious. So I started with what I knew. After the crash, rehabilitation had taken months. For the first 6 weeks, my world had been a rotating collection of ceiling tiles, physical therapists, plastic water pitchers, medication cups, and people telling me not to rush. Madison went home before I did. Her injuries looked worse at the scene, but mine kept me in rehabilitation longer. She healed physically much faster. The part that lingered for her was driving. The first time I rode in a car with her after the crash, she lasted 3 blocks before asking Mom to pull over. Mom climbed into the passenger seat beside her and held her hand. "You don't have to force this," she told Madison. I remember sitting in the back seat with a cane between my knees, looking at the clock because I had a physical therapy appointment in 20 minutes. Mom turned around. "Rachel, you can take a rideshare, right?" "Sure. You're better with this stuff." That had been the beginning of a phrase I would hear in different forms for years. Rachel can manage. Rachel understands. Rachel doesn't need as much. At first, being called strong had felt almost flattering. There were days during rehab when strength was the only thing I had to trade for dignity. If I could shower without help, I was improving. If I could walk 10 more feet, I was improving. If I could stop crying before Mom arrived, I was improving. The problem was that my parents never seemed to notice when recovery ended and expectation began. Within a year, Mom helped organize a small fundraiser for crash survivors who needed transportation to rehabilitation appointments. I remember approving of it. Not participating. Approving. There was a difference. The first event was held in the fellowship hall of a local church. Madison spoke for 5 minutes about being afraid to get into cars after the wreck. Mom stood beside her, with one hand between Madison's shoulder blades. Someone asked whether I wanted to say a few words too. No, thank you, I said. Mom waited until we were outside to tell me I had embarrassed her. You could have helped people understand what recovery looks like. I don't want strangers hearing my medical history. They already know there was an accident. That's not the same thing. Her mouth tightened. You always make everything difficult. That night, I sent an email because conversations with my mother had a way of changing shape afterward. Please don't use my medical details, my rehabilitation history, or my part of the crash story in fundraising material. I support the transportation project. I do not want to be a public example. The email was still in my archive. 9 years old. 3 sentences. No ambiguity. I saved a copy into the folder on my laptop. The timestamp sat there, like a pin driven into the timeline. For the first time that afternoon, something inside me eased. Not because the situation looked better, because I had stopped relying on memory. The record had begun. A few hours later, another phrase in the annual reports caught my attention. 2 survivor households stabilized. The report was 7 years old. Back then, I had read it once and assumed the second household belonged to someone else the foundation had helped. Now I enlarged the page. The paragraph underneath referred to founding family recovery outcomes. My stomach tightened. I opened the following year. Different wording. Same idea. 2 daughters. Long-term recovery. Stable independent living. One of them was clearly Madison. The other could only be me. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. For 10 years, I had thought my mother's public version of the crash was sentimental, overpolished, self-serving. I had not considered that sentiment could become data. That evening, I did what I always did when a story started drifting away from its source. I built a comparison, public report on the left, my records on the right, closing date, mortgage origination, down payment, property taxes, insurance, roof replacement, electrical work, plumbing, renovation invoices. Every major payment came from my accounts. No check from the foundation. No housing grant. No mortgage contribution. No reimbursement. Nothing. Naomi called just after 7. You still alive? Unfortunately. That sounds promising. Depends on your definition. She laughed once. What did you find? A pattern. That's not proof. I know. Good. The answer annoyed me only because she was right. Several public reports describe long-term housing stability for both daughters. Do they name the property? No. Do they say they paid for it? No. Then, what exactly are you trying to establish? The question made me stop. Not what I suspected, what I needed to establish. That they represented me as a beneficiary of housing support without actually providing housing support. Better. Her voice remained even. Don't audit the universe, Rachel. Find the sentence about you. Then find its source. I looked at the spreadsheet. Claim. Source. Contradiction. What if there is no source? Then that becomes the answer. After we hung up, I found myself thinking about all the things my family had called support. That word had always stretched farther when it applied to me. 2 years after the crash, Mom called before Thanksgiving and said she was too overwhelmed by foundation work to host dinner. I arranged catering and paid for it. Nobody mentioned the cost. Madison gave a short speech at a fundraiser the following week about how showing up matters more than money. Mom posted the clip 3 times. 4 years after the crash, Dad called because their air conditioning system failed in August. The repair was $3,800. I paid it. A month later, Mom posted a photograph of Madison driving Dad to a medical appointment. The caption read, "Some daughters never stop showing up." I remember staring at that sentence for longer than I should have. Year 6, Mom asked me to review a grant budget for free. I refused. Not because I didn't care. Because by then I was consulting professionally and reviewing a nonprofit run by my own mother without an engagement letter, scope, or conflict analysis was exactly the kind of sloppy arrangement I told clients to avoid. 3 relatives called me that week. Each of them used a version of the same sentence. Your mother says you won't even help the charity that came from saving your life. The foundation did not save my life. Paramedics did. Surgeons did. Rehabilitation staff did. Mostly, time did. But once a sentence survives long enough, people stop asking who wrote it. By midnight, I had 6 reports open and a headache forming behind my right eye. One sentence had changed everything. Now I needed to know whether the organization had ever formally classified me as a beneficiary. The next morning, I drafted a request, then deleted it, drafted another, deleted half of that. Naomi read the third version over the phone. You're asking for too much. I'm asking whether there was ever a housing benefit. You're also asking for internal board deliberations, funding schedules, and historical program notes, because I want to know how they reached the conclusion. Later. Her tone sharpened slightly. Right now, your name is in their outcome reporting. You dispute the accuracy of information attributed to you. Ask them to verify the specific benefit they say you received. That was cleaner. Also harder for anyone to dismiss as a daughter digging through her mother's organization. The final request was short. I identified myself, cited the reports, disputed the characterization of my housing as foundation supported. Asked the foundation to verify whether any direct housing grant, mortgage subsidy, property assistance, or housing payment had ever been formally authorized or paid to me. Then, I sent it through the foundation's published data correction and beneficiary verification address. The response did not come immediately. Good processes usually didn't. While I waited, Madison texted, "Can we talk without Mom?" I stared at the screen, then typed back, "Tomorrow, 11. Harbor Cafe." She arrived 9 minutes late, wearing sunglasses, even though we were sitting indoors. The waitress set down coffee. Madison didn't touch hers. "You're really doing this?" "Doing what?" "Going through foundation records. My name is in them. You know what I mean." "No, I don't." She pulled off the sunglasses. "You're turning everything into a case." "It became a case when Mom asked me to certify something. She said it was paperwork. That's usually what certification is." Madison groaned. "Can you not talk to me like I'm one of your clients? Then don't repeat Mom's language like you've read the document." Her face changed. "I haven't read it." That mattered. I folded my hands on the table. "Have you seen any of the papers they brought to my house?" "No." "Did you ask them to?" "No." "Did you ask for the villa?" "I asked Mom if she thought you might let me stay with you for a few weeks." The answer irritated me less than it should have. At least it was specific. "And what did she say?" "She said she would handle it." "Of course she did." Madison stared at her coffee. After a moment she said, "I didn't know Dad was going to bring up your work." "That part bothered you?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because it was gross." The word sounded almost adolescent coming from her, but I appreciated its accuracy. She picked at the paper sleeve around her cup. "Mom has always said you got more help after the accident." I looked at her. "More help than you?" "She said your rehab cost more, that everybody had to organize around you for months. She said I got better faster, so speaking for the foundation was how I could give something back." A strange pressure built behind my ribs. "Did she tell you I asked not to be used in fundraising?" Madison looked up. "No." "Did she tell you I never wanted to be part of the foundation story?" "No." The waitress passed behind us, carrying a tray of glasses. Neither of us spoke until she was gone. Madison said, "Mom wrote my first speech. That was not a confession. Just a fact." "When?" "The church event. The first one." I remembered her at the microphone, hands shaking. "I thought you wrote it." I was 26 and terrified. She gave a humorless little laugh. I told her I didn't want to do another one. She said the foundation was the reason surviving had to mean something. My fingers tightened around the coffee cup. Madison continued. "After that, it got easier." "You liked it?" "Sometimes." She looked at me directly. "I liked people being proud of me." There it was. Not innocence, not villainy. Something more irritatingly human. "And the salary?" "I liked that too." "Travel?" "Yes." "Being introduced as the reason the foundation exists?" Her mouth tightened. "Yes, Rachel. I liked things. At least we agree on one fact." She almost smiled. Almost. Then her expression shifted. "Mom has asked me 3 times this week whether you signed." I waited. "She hasn't asked me." That was new. "What exactly did she ask?" "Whether you were being difficult. Whether you understood Friday mattered." "Anything else?" Madison hesitated, then unlocked her phone. "She texted me this morning. She pushed the phone across the table. The message was from Mom. Do not argue about the apartment with Rachel. The signature has to be handled first. I read it once. Then again. Send me that. Madison pulled the phone back. Why? Because it directly contradicts the reason they gave me for the meeting. She stared at me. You're going to use it against Mom. I'm going to preserve what she wrote. That sounds the same. It isn't. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then Madison forwarded the text. My phone buzzed. Not decisive evidence. Not proof of a lie. But one more piece in the right place. Madison leaned back. If this was really about me, why does she care more about your signature than where I sleep? I had no answer yet. That was exactly the problem. Later that afternoon, the foundation replied to my verification request. The email came from Carla Ruiz, the board secretary. Her message was formal and careful. Miss Cole, we have completed the requested verification, limited to direct housing assistance attributed to you. Attached was a short certified statement. No board-authorized direct housing grant. No mortgage subsidy. No property acquisition assistance. No housing payment to Rachel Cole. I read the page 3 times. The most useful evidence in the world was often boring. This was beautifully boring. One paragraph. One date. One signature. Carla's email included one additional sentence. The hospital network partner had requested expanded source documentation during the current renewal cycle, including beneficiary confirmation for selected long-term outcomes. There it was. The mechanism. The old reports had survived for years without my signature. Something had changed. Now somebody wanted the story tied back to a source. My father answered on the second ring. Rachel, did you sign the annual certifications? A pause. What? The foundation reports. Did you sign them? Your mother handled the narrative sections. That wasn't my question. He sighed. Yes, I signed annual certifications as treasurer. Did you know I was being described as a long-term supported outcome? Rachel, nobody said the foundation bought your house. Did you know? Another pause. I knew the reports described the family's recovery. That's not the same thing. The foundation helped keep all of us stable. No, it helped the foundation's beneficiaries. Maybe it helped you and Mom emotionally. Maybe Madison earned money from it. That does not turn my mortgage into foundation support. You benefited from the stability around you. I closed my eyes. There it was. The category had stretched again. Family, stability. Therefore, Rachel benefited. Therefore, Rachel counted. Then why do you need my signature now? Dad stopped talking. Not forever. Just long enough. When he finally answered, his voice was lower. Because this review is different. I looked at Carla's email. Different how? They want more documentation. Documentation you don't have. That's not what I said. It's what you didn't say. Rachel, do not blow up 10 years of good work over language. Language is what you signed. He exhaled sharply. You always have to make everything absolute. No, I make it sourced. Then I hung up. For a long time, I sat at my desk with the certified statement on one screen and the old annual report on the other. The foundation had done real work. That fact had complicated everything. If it had been fake from top to bottom, anger would have been easier. But real people had received rides to rehabilitation. Real people had been referred to temporary housing. Real people had returned to work because somebody had helped them get through the months when a broken car became a broken routine. Good work existed. So did a false claim about me. Those two facts did not cancel each other. My inbox chimed. Mom. Subject. Compromise. I opened it. Rachel. We are willing to remove the house transfer language entirely. Madison can make other arrangements. All we need is your signature on the survivor outcome acknowledgement so the foundation can complete its reporting obligations. I hope you understand that I am trying to resolve this without further damage to anyone. Mom. I read the email twice, then a third time. The villa had been urgent yesterday. Madison deserved my house yesterday. My refusal had been proof of selfishness yesterday. Now the house could disappear from the discussion completely. All I had to do was sign. A laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Not because anything was funny. Because the shape of the pressure was finally visible. The house had never been the thing they needed most. It was the thing they thought would make me afraid enough, guilty enough, or ashamed enough to give them what they actually wanted. My name, under their version of the truth. The email stayed open on my screen long enough for the words to stop looking like sentences and start looking like an invoice. Remove the house transfer language entirely. Madison can make other arrangements. All we need is your signature. That was the exchange. My villa for my name. Except the villa had never really been on the table in the way Mom wanted me to believe. Not legally, not financially. It had been pressure. A large, visible thing she knew would make me defensive enough to focus on the wrong threat. The real transaction was much smaller. One signature. One paragraph. One lie wearing a clean shirt. Mom called before I could decide whether to answer her email. The phone buzzed across my desk. I let it ring twice, then picked up. What? Her voice was softer than it had been on my porch. I'd like to come by. No, Rachel. You were here yesterday. I'm not bringing anyone. That made me hesitate. No Dad? No. No Madison? No. Why? Because I'm trying to compromise. The word landed exactly where she intended. Compromise sounded reasonable. Adult. Civilized. It suggested two people were meeting halfway, rather than one person being asked to certify something she knew was false. Tomorrow morning, I said. 10. Mom arrived at 9:58. Of course she did. She stood on the porch without the leather folder this time. That bothered me more than if she had brought it. The papers were already inside. She no longer needed to carry the pressure visibly. I opened the door but did not move aside. You can come into the kitchen. Her eyes flicked toward the hallway. Maybe she noticed. Maybe she didn't. I had no way of knowing, so I stopped trying to read meaning into her face. She followed me to the island and sat on the stool nearest the window. I remained standing. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Mom folded her hands. I meant what I wrote. That narrows it down. We will drop the house arrangement. You never had a claim to the house. I know you believe that. No, I know that. Her jaw tightened. I pulled the acknowledgement from the folder and placed it between us. This is what you want. Yes. Why? To complete the reporting. That isn't an answer. It is the answer. Then, explain the reporting. She exhaled. The hospital network wants additional confirmation this year. I know. Her eyes sharpened. From whom? Does it matter? It matters if people inside my organization are talking to you. Nobody leaked anything to me. That was true. Carla had responded through a formal channel to a request about my own reported beneficiary status. Mom looked at the paper. We have spent 10 years building something that helps people. I'm aware. You've said repeatedly that you respect the work. I do. Then stop treating this like we're trying to steal something from you. I tapped the acknowledgement. You're trying to get me to validate something that isn't true. It is true in substance. That phrase made me sit down. In substance. The foundation grew out of our recovery. It gave this family structure. It created support networks. It connected us to doctors, rehabilitation resources, survivor groups. It didn't buy my house. No one says it did. Then why is my house being used as a housing outcome? She looked away for the first time. Only for a second. The reporting language is broader than that. Broader is not the same as accurate. Her hand flattened over the edge of the island. This is what you do. You take one phrase and act as though the whole world hangs on it. In my work, sometimes it does. You're not at work. No, that's the problem. For a moment, all I could hear was the air conditioner. Mom leaned back. Fine. She spoke the word quietly. We remove you from future fundraising materials. We stop using your name. We stop asking about the house. Madison makes other arrangements. Your father and I stop involving you in foundation business. There it was. Everything I had spent years wanting. Distance. No emergency calls. No guilt disguised as responsibility. No more being volunteered. Mom looked at me. You can finally be left alone. My chest tightened. That sentence hurt more than the threat on the porch, because it sounded like mercy. The paper lay between us. I read the paragraph again. Accurate in all material respects. 5 words. 5 words could buy me silence. What happens if I don't sign? Mom's expression hardened. The review becomes harder. That isn't what I asked. You know how people talk. So we're back to that. I'm saying I can't control what people think if you decide to turn this into an attack on the foundation. You seemed pretty confident yesterday that you could control what they heard. Her mouth tightened. Do you want peace or not? That was the first truly honest question she had asked. Not truth. Peace. I slid the paper back toward her. I need time. How much? I'll tell you when I know. Friday is still the deadline. So you keep saying. She stood. At the door, Mom turned back. For what it's worth, Rachel, I really am trying to give you what you say you want. After she left, I locked the door and carried the acknowledgement to the kitchen. The pen was already there. For almost 10 minutes, nothing happened. No revelation. No swelling music. Just me sitting at the island with a document that could make most of the immediate pressure disappear. Signing it would not give Madison my house. It would not give Mom a key. It would not drain my account. No one would force me into court. The temptation came precisely because the cost was invisible. One signature. One compromised fact. One institutional sentence saying my mother's version was close enough. The pen rolled beneath my fingertips. My work phone lit up with a reminder from a client. Quarterly source review. I stared at the notification, then laughed once. Dryly. If one of my clients had brought me this exact document and said, "We know the wording isn't right, but the program does good work," I would have given them the same answer without needing 5 minutes. Good outcome does not cure false source. I wrote the sentence on the yellow pad beside me, then capped the pen. The acknowledgement went back into the folder, unsigned. Something loosened inside me. Not relief. More like the unpleasant freedom of knowing which choice was mine. The rest of the afternoon, I refused to let the problem consume the house. That decision was harder than it sounded. For 6 years, the guest bedroom across from my office had remained mostly untouched. A bed, a dresser, a lamp, 2 empty drawers. Mom had joked more than once that it was good I kept a proper room because you never know when somebody might need you. Somehow, the room had become a physical reservation. Not for a specific person, for the next crisis. I stood in the doorway and looked at the bed, then opened the closet. Half the shelves were empty. The idea came so simply that it felt embarrassing. I wanted a reading room, not an impressive one. A chair near the window, bookshelves, a small table. Somewhere that did not contain a monitor, a grant report, a client file, or a spare toothbrush waiting for a relative. By 4 o'clock, the mattress had been listed for donation pickup. The dresser stayed. The lamp stayed. The bed frame did not. I ordered 2 narrow oak bookcases and moved an old reading chair upstairs from the living room. Nothing about it was dramatic. That was why it mattered. For years, I had built my life around being prepared for what other people might need. For once, I changed a room because of what I wanted to do in it. Dad texted while I was measuring the wall. "Can we talk tomorrow?" I almost said no. Instead, we met the next morning at a park near the bay. He was already sitting on a bench when I arrived. A paper coffee cup rested between both hands. No folder. No speech. "Mom told me you won't sign," he said. "She told you correctly." He nodded. The water beyond him was bright enough to hurt my eyes. After a while, Dad said, "There's something you should understand." I waited. He stared at the cup. "After the crash, your mother didn't sleep right for months." The words made my shoulders stiffen. "She would wake up and say she could hear you calling from the car." I said nothing. This was his account, not mine. He continued. "The church fundraiser helped. At first it was just rides, gas cards, volunteers taking people to therapy. Your mother needed something useful to do. I remember. She became focused." His hesitation told me he was choosing the word. That project gave her a way to talk about what happened, without talking about what happened. My gaze stayed on the water. Dad said, "She started telling people we survived together." A gull landed near the path. I noticed. She needed that version. The sentence sat between us. Not absolution, not excuse. Just mechanism. Dad rubbed his thumb along the cardboard seam of the cup. "I think the foundation started as help. Then it became proof your mother needed, that she had been a good mother that day." The sound of traffic drifted across the park. For years, some part of me had wanted exactly this. An admission, not from Mom, but close enough to feel dangerous. "So you knew," I said. I knew she was carrying guilt. "That's not what I asked." His head lifted. "You signed the reports." He closed his eyes briefly. "Rachel, you signed them." "Yes. You signed language that described me as an outcome. I didn't write those sections. But you certified them. Real people were getting help." There it was again. The arithmetic of good intentions. Dad leaned forward. "People got rides to treatment, temporary housing, job placement support. I told myself the wording about us was family mess. You signed your name where the family mess became a record." His grip tightened around the cup. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then he said, "Your mother isn't trying to hurt you." I didn't say she was. "She thinks this is about protecting what she built." "That may be what she thinks." That was as far as I would go. I could not narrate what Mom believed. I only knew what she had said, written, and asked me to sign. Dad looked at me. "Is there any version of this where you don't contact the hospital network? If the foundation corrects the record itself?" He looked away. "That's more complicated than you think." "No. It's exactly as complicated as the record makes it." When we stood to leave, Dad said, "I wish you wouldn't make this the thing that breaks everything." The old reflex rose immediately. Reassure him. Soften it. Tell him I was still thinking. Instead, I said, "It broke before I started documenting it." Back home, the shelves I had ordered were waiting in long cardboard boxes beside the front door. I stepped around them and went straight to my office. The correction packet took most of the afternoon. Not because the evidence was difficult, because discipline was. The first draft was too angry. Naomi read it on a video call. "You can't prove that sentence." "Which one?" She highlighted it. "Deliberately misrepresented." "I have 9 years of reporting." "You have 9 years of inconsistent attribution." "You have current pressure." "You have a retroactive acknowledgement." "You do not have direct evidence of what Elaine intended 9 years ago." I stared at the line. Every part of me wanted to keep it. It felt true. That was not enough. I deleted it. Naomi nodded. "Better. I hate when you're right. That's why you keep calling." The final packet was smaller, cleaner. The claim. The public source. My closing statement. Mortgage records. Tax and insurance history. The foundation's formal verification that no direct housing assistance had been authorized to me. My old email asking Mom not to use my recovery story. The current acknowledgement. Nothing else. No speculation. No character analysis. No accusation I could not source. Just enough truth that someone else would have to ask the next question. Naomi leaned closer to her screen. "If you send this, you lose control of what the hospital does with it." "I know. Do you?" "Yes. That was the real cost. Correcting my record could affect an organization doing useful work. There was no way to guarantee otherwise." The doorbell rang before I could answer. Madison stood outside. She did not wait for an invitation to speak. "Are you contacting the hospital?" "Yes." Her face tightened. "You can't be serious." "I am." "What happens to the staff?" "I don't know." "The people they help?" "I don't know." "Then how can you do this?" "Because the alternative is signing something false." She shook her head. "This is still about the accident." "No. It is for me." I stepped back from the door. "Come in." We sat at the kitchen island. For the first time, I showed her the acknowledgement. Not the whole file. Only the pages connected to her housing request and my signature. She read them once. Then again. Her fingers stopped beneath the retroactive language. "This doesn't help me get an apartment." "No." "Then why was it in the paperwork about me?" "That's what I've been asking." She looked at me. "You said Mom would drop the house thing if you signed?" I opened her mother's email and turned the screen toward her. Madison read it. Her mouth opened slightly. "She told me this was about getting me somewhere safe." "I believe that's what she told you." She looked down at the document again. "This goes back years." "Yes. Before my divorce." "Yes. Before I needed somewhere to live." "Yes." Her hands flattened on the counter. For a moment, anger crossed her face. Then something else. Not clarity. "Not yet." Disorientation. She used me. I chose my words carefully. She used your housing problem to pressure me. Madison swallowed. That's not better. No. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "Do you know why I kept doing the speeches? I assumed you liked them." I did. That answer surprised me more than a denial would have. I liked people being proud of me. I liked having something good attached to the accident. Her voice dropped. I was the one they pulled out. The sentence made the kitchen seem smaller. Madison. No. Let me say it. She looked directly at me. You were still in the car. I knew that. Even when I was 26, I knew it. Her breathing changed. Every time Mom said the foundation gave meaning to what happened, it made it easier not to think about why I was the one in the hospital with both parents. There was nothing useful to say, so I did not say anything. After a moment, she rubbed both palms over her jeans. Mom wants me to introduce the family at the luncheon next week. What does she want you to say? That we're united again. I waited. Madison looked at the unsigned acknowledgement. I'm not saying that. The words were quiet, but they belonged to her, not me. Are you going to tell her why? I don't know. That's your decision. Her head snapped up, almost as if she expected instructions. None came. She frowned. What about the apartment list? What about it? You said you'd help me. I said I would send you a few rental sites. You did. I'm not managing the search. She stared at me. So that's it? You need housing. You're capable of looking for housing. That sounds easy when you say it. It isn't easy. Then help. The old guilt found the exact spot beneath my ribs. For years, capability had been used against me. Now Madison was asking me to use mine for her. I care whether you're safe, I said. I'm not managing where you live. Her face hardened. That's selfish. Maybe it feels that way. She stood. At the door, Madison stopped. If Mom knew this could be fixed without losing the program, why wouldn't she just fix it? I don't know. That answer bothered me long after she left. The correction packet waited on my screen. Sending it took less than a second. The preparation had taken 2 days. The decision had taken 10 years. My email went to the hospital network's compliance contact listed in the renewal materials. No threats. No demand for punishment. I stated that I was correcting claims attributed to me, that I did not consent to my villa being described as foundation-supported housing, that I could substantiate my purchase and payment history, that I was available to answer questions about my own records. Then I clicked send. My hands were shaking afterward. Not before. After. Dr. Maya Bennett replied the next morning and scheduled a short verification call. Her questions were precise. Did the foundation contribute to the purchase of your current residence? No. Mortgage? No. Property taxes? No. Insurance? No. Major renovations? No. Were you ever asked to sign a beneficiary acknowledgement before the current renewal cycle? No. A pause followed. That timing is relevant to our verification. She did not tell me what the hospital intended to do. I did not ask her to. 3 days later, a formal notice arrived. The hospital network was not terminating services. Instead, it offered a correction path. Unsupported references to me had to be removed. Affected outcome material had to be corrected. Source documentation had to be cleaned up. The foundation's family origin storytelling had to be separated from verified program metrics, and the flagship renewal would temporarily operate under independent administration while the correction was completed. I read the notice twice. Then once more. The work could continue. People could still receive transportation, housing referrals, rehabilitation support. Nobody had to burn down the building. All Mom had to do was correct the record and surrender some control during the review. Relief came so fast that I laughed. Then my phone rang. Mom, I answered. She did not say hello. What did you send them? Records about me. They're demanding independent administration. They're offering a way to preserve the program. You don't understand what they're asking. They're asking you to correct unsupported claims. They're asking me to strip the foundation of its identity. No, they're asking you to separate the story from the metrics. Her breathing came through the phone. Then she said the sentence that finally made everything fit. If we remove our story, we remove the reason any of this exists. I looked through the open office door. The new oak bookcases were still boxed in the hallway. A room that had spent 6 years waiting for somebody else's emergency was finally becoming mine. Mom was still speaking, but for once I did not rush to fill the space between us. The program had a way to survive. The truth had a way to survive. The only thing being threatened was her right to make them the same thing. And for the first time, that was not something I was willing to carry for her. The invitation arrived the next morning. Not from Mom, from the foundation. The email subject line read, Annual Survivor Luncheon, Founding Family Guest. My name appeared beneath it in bold. Rachel Cole, Founding Family Survivor Guest. For several seconds, the phrasing irritated me more than it should have. Not daughter. Not consultant. Not private citizen who had explicitly asked not to be used as part of the foundation's story. Founding Family Survivor Guest. A role. Another one. Below the invitation was a polite note about the luncheon, the hospital partnership, and a decade of shared recovery. Then, 10 minutes later, Mom sent a separate family email and copied several board members. It is time our whole family stood together again. I read that sentence twice. The first time as a daughter, the second time as a compliance consultant. Attendance could be treated as participation. Participation could be described as reconciliation. Reconciliation could be turned into implied agreement. The invitation was not proof of anything by itself, but it created a choice. Stay away, and Mom could say I refused peace. Show up and say nothing, and she could use my presence as a clean visual. For the first time since the correction packet went out, the question was not what she had already written. It was what she planned to make my presence mean. Naomi called around noon. You're going? Yes. Why? Because I was formally invited. That isn't what I asked. I looked at the email on my screen. Because if I stay home, she tells the room I couldn't let go of the past. If I show up and keep my mouth shut, she tells them everything has been resolved. And if you go? She only gets to use what I actually do. Naomi was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Good, but don't go in there hoping to correct the whole history. I'm not. How many facts? 4. That's still ambitious. 3.5. She laughed. Write them down. So I did. My house. My payments. No previous acknowledgement. My formal correction. Nothing about motive. Nothing about Mom's guilt. Nothing about what Dad should have known. Nothing about Madison's role. If my mother tried to turn the luncheon into evidence, I would correct the part attached to me. No more. That afternoon, I finished assembling the first bookcase in the room across from my office. The second one leaned against the wall in 3 pieces because I had installed one shelf backward and refused to admit defeat for almost 20 minutes. By the time I fixed it, my hands smelled faintly of wood dust and metal screws. The room was starting to look like something. Not much. 1 chair, 2 shelves, a small table under the window. But there was no bed waiting for someone to need me. That mattered. The morning of the luncheon, I spent an hour there before getting dressed. No foundation materials. No emails. No family group chat. I drank coffee and read 12 pages of a novel I had been carrying from room to room for 6 months without opening. It felt almost absurdly normal. That was exactly why I stayed. At 11:30, I closed the book, set it face down on the table, and went upstairs to change. The luncheon was being held at a waterfront conference center the foundation had used twice before. When I arrived, a volunteer at the registration table smiled. Miss Cole? Yes. She checked my name. Oh, good. Your mother was hoping you'd come. Of course she was. The volunteer handed me a name badge. Rachel Cole, Founding Family Survivor Guest. The exact same wording. I clipped it to my jacket and walked inside. The room held about 100 people. Round tables. White linens. Small centerpieces in glass cylinders. A stage at the front with 2 banners, the foundation logo and the hospital network logo. The sight of both logos together steadied me. Whatever Mom wanted this room to be, it was not only hers. Madison stood near the sidewall, speaking with 2 staff members. She saw me and excused herself. You came. I was invited. Her mouth twisted. That sounds very official. It was an official invitation. She looked toward the stage. I told Mom I'm not doing the introduction. Okay. That's all? What do you want me to say? I don't know. Neither of us had gotten very good at this yet. Madison crossed her arms. She's furious. I assumed. Dad says the hospital is overreacting. That sounds like Dad. She looked at me. Do you think they're going to pull the program? I don't know. That answer had become strangely useful. The old Rachel would have tried to predict every outcome so everyone else could prepare. The newer version was learning that uncertainty did not become my responsibility just because I could describe it. Madison lowered her voice. Mom told me the independent administration thing was insulting. She told me removing the story would remove the reason the foundation exists. Her expression changed. That's not the same thing. No. No. Before she could answer, Dad approached. He looked tired. Not dramatic. Just worn down in the ordinary way people look when they have spent too many days trying to manage consequences. Rachel, can I talk to you? Madison stepped away. Dad nodded toward a hallway near the ballroom doors. We moved far enough from the crowd that no one had to pretend not to listen. He kept his voice low. Your mother is still trying to negotiate. With the hospital. Yes. What does that have to do with me? She needs time. For what? To work through the conditions. They already gave her a correction path. You know what they're asking. Yes. Independent administration. Temporarily. You say that like it's nothing. I didn't say it was nothing. Dad rubbed a hand over his face. Withdraw your correction until after renewal. For a second, I genuinely thought I had misheard him. No, just give us a year. A year of what? Stability. The word almost made me laugh. Whose? Rachel. No, really. Whose stability? His mouth hardened. The foundation employs people. I know. People rely on these programs. I know. Then stop acting like this only affects Mom. It doesn't only affect Mom. Good. It also doesn't make the record true. Dad looked away. A waiter passed with a tray of water glasses. The normality of it made the conversation feel stranger. He said, just give us 1 year. And next year? No answer. That was the whole bargain. Not fix it. Delay it. Let me carry the false statement one more cycle because correcting it now was inconvenient. The doctrine had survived 10 years because it rarely asked for forever. It asked for this week, this month, this emergency, this 1 more year. I'm not extending a false record. Dad looked at me. Then whatever happens to your mother is on you. The sentence hit exactly where he meant it to. I felt it. Then let it stay there without accepting it. She had a correction path. She thinks the conditions are unreasonable. That is her decision. He shook his head. You always make everything sound so clean. No, I make responsibility stay with the person making the choice. The ballroom doors opened wider behind us. A staff member announced that lunch service would begin shortly. Dad stared at me for another moment, then went inside. I followed. My seat was at a table near the front, not with Mom, not with Dad, not with Madison. That was almost a relief. A survivor advocate sat on my right. A hospital rehabilitation coordinator sat on my left. We made polite conversation through salad and coffee. Nobody asked about the villa. Nobody asked whether I hated my mother. Nobody asked why I had contacted the hospital network. Real life, annoyingly, was rarely as obsessed with my family as my family believed. After lunch, the lights dimmed slightly. Mom stepped onto the stage. The applause was warm, not thunderous. Warm. She looked composed. Dark blue dress. Foundation pin. Notes on the podium. The same woman who had stood in church halls, hotel ballrooms, rehabilitation centers, and donor events for years telling a version of our lives polished smooth enough for public consumption. She began with the crash. 10 years ago, both my daughters survived because our family never stopped choosing one another. My fingers tightened around the edge of the napkin. The ballroom disappeared for half a second. Hot metal. Airbag dust. Dad's face outside the wreckage. Rachel can hold on. Then the room came back. Glasses. Silverware. White tablecloth. Hospital logo. Mom continued. She spoke about recovery becoming service. Pain becoming purpose. Madison's courage in speaking publicly. Then she mentioned me. Our other miracle, she called me. My shoulders went rigid. She told the room that one daughter became a public advocate while the other rebuilt an independent life, a living example of the long-term stability this work makes possible. There it was. Not my name in a spreadsheet. Not a paragraph in a report. My life. Spoken aloud. Mom smiled toward my table. We've had some private misunderstandings recently, as families do. Several people turned toward me. Then she said, Rachel, would you stand for a moment so everyone can see what this program helped make possible? For 1 second, the room seemed very still. Not because anyone else knew what was happening, because I did. If I stayed seated, I looked angry. If I stood and smiled, I became confirmation. Mom had found a third kind of signature. Social. I stood. My heart was beating hard enough that I could feel it under my jacket. Mom smiled wider. Come say a few words. I had not planned to walk to the stage. That part changed because she asked me publicly. I picked up the small card from beside my plate, then walked forward. The room remained polite. Curious. Nothing more. Mom stepped slightly away from the microphone. I stopped beside the podium. Since my home and recovery were just referenced, I need to correct 4 facts about my own record. The smile left her face. Nobody moved. My villa was purchased by me. The room stayed quiet. The foundation did not fund the purchase. Mortgage, property taxes, insurance, or renovations. Mom whispered, Rachel. I continued. I was never asked to sign a beneficiary acknowledgement before the current renewal review. A shift moved through the front tables. Small. Chairs. Breathing. Pens. And I have formally requested that my home and personal recovery not be represented as foundation-supported outcomes. Mom reached for the microphone. This is a family disagreement. I looked at her. My feelings are family. My signature is documentation. Her eyes changed. The calm mask did not disappear completely, but the effort required to hold it became visible. The one who can carry more should carry more, she said. The old doctrine, delivered into a microphone. The sentence that had excused everything from rides to bills to holidays to my sister standing on my porch with a housing crisis that somehow needed my signature to solve. I answered quietly. Carrying more is not the same as consenting to carry what belongs to someone else. Then I stepped away. No applause. Thank God. I did not want applause. A few people looked down at their programs. Someone near the back coughed. The hospital representative at the side of the stage made a note. I returned to my seat. My hands were shaking beneath the table. The survivor advocate beside me said nothing. That kindness helped more than reassurance would have. The luncheon continued. A video played. 2 survivors spoke about getting rides to rehabilitation after discharge. One woman described temporary housing support after an accident left her unable to return to a second-floor apartment. The programs were real. Listening to them made the whole thing hurt more. Those services deserved clean records. They also deserved not to depend on my mother owning my past. Near the end of the program, a hospital network representative walked to the podium. I recognized him from the partner materials, though we had never spoken. He thanked the foundation staff. Then his tone shifted. For transparency, we also want to address the next program cycle. My mother sat very still at the front table. He explained that current services would continue through the end of the existing contract. No abrupt cancellations. No patients dropped midstream. No transportation referrals cut off that week. Relief moved through the room before he continued. The hospital network would not renew the flagship road recovery program under the Cole Road Recovery Foundation for the next cycle. Instead, funding and referral coordination would move to a regional nonprofit consortium under independent administration. Eligible staff would be allowed to apply for transition. Existing beneficiaries would be supported through the handoff. There was no dramatic gasp. No one stood up. The most important consequences rarely arrived with music. They arrived as administrative sentences. Contract ends. Renewal declined. New administrator. Mom did not move for several seconds. Madison was sitting 2 tables away. She looked from the podium to Mom, then back again. When the presentation ended, The room filled with low conversation. People stood slowly. Some approached staff members. Others collected bags and coats. Nobody came to me with a verdict. That was fine. I had not come for one. Madison caught up with Mom near the side of the stage. I was close enough to hear because I was waiting for a clear path toward the exit. "You knew this could happen?" Madison asked. Mom looked at her. "This is not the place. You knew the program could stay if you corrected the record?" The conditions were insulting. Madison stared at her. "So you said no?" "Madison. You said no?" Mom glanced toward me. That was enough. Madison followed her gaze. For once, she did not immediately turn her anger in my direction. She did not defend me either. She just stopped talking. That was new. Dad appeared beside them. A board member approached and said something quietly to him. Then, loud enough for me to hear, "Thomas, we need you to stay for the governance review session." Dad looked down at the treasurer lanyard hanging from his neck. He removed it, not dramatically, just unclipped it and held it in his hand. Then walked back toward the meeting rooms with the board member. I did not know what would happen in that room, so I did not invent it. Mom found me in the corridor 10 minutes later. Her face was controlled again. "Almost. You took everything I built." The words came out low. "No. You went around me. They gave you a correction path. You humiliated me. They offered to keep the program with you if you corrected the record." Her mouth tightened. "You don't understand what that foundation is." "I understand what it does." "No." She stepped closer. "Without our story, there was no foundation." There it was. Not fraud. Not confession. Something more useful. Truth about ownership. The foundation did good work. But somewhere along the way, Mom had tied that work so tightly to her version of us that separating the two felt like destruction. I did not need to tell her that. She had just told me. "That was your choice," I said. Her eyes filled with anger. "You think this makes you right?" "No." That seemed to stop her. "I think the record is corrected." Then I walked away. Madison caught me outside near the parking lot. The afternoon sun reflected off the windshields hard enough to make me squint. "What happens to me now?" she asked. The question was so familiar that my mind answered before my mouth could. "Call 3 apartment managers. Check deposit requirements. Build a budget. Ask whether she had short-term storage. See if her credit had recovered after the divorce. Make a list. Fix it." My whole body knew the routine. "Instead," I said, "I don't know." She stared at me. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I don't know. I lost the ambassador contract." I heard. "My lease is still ending." "I know. So what am I supposed to do?" There it was. The transfer. Her crisis moving toward me, looking for the old place to land. "You'll figure it out." Her face hardened. "That's all you have to say?" "Yes." Wow. Maybe she wanted me to defend myself. I didn't. She looked away toward the road. After a long moment, she said, "Mom really used my apartment to get that signature." I chose my words carefully. "She used your housing crisis as pressure." Madison swallowed. "That's not the same as you saying she used me." "No. Why won't you just say it? Because that part is yours to decide." She looked at me then. Really looked. For once, I did not step into the empty space and fill it for her. Madison shook her head. "You're different." "I'm trying to be." She gave a short, unhappy laugh. "Good for you." Then she walked toward her car. I drove home alone. The first thing I saw when I entered the hallway was the framed article, "The Family That Turned Tragedy into Hope." For years, I had kept it because throwing it away felt too dramatic. Then later, because it was evidence. Now neither reason seemed strong enough to leave it on the wall. I took it down. The hook behind it left a small pale mark in the paint. The frame felt heavier than I remembered. I carried it into the reading room and set it against the wall beside the unfinished bookcase. Then my phone buzzed. The family group chat. 3 new messages. I did not open them. Instead, I picked up the screwdriver. The second bookcase still needed 2 shelves. 20 minutes later, both stood level against the wall. Not perfectly, but mine. I put a novel on the first shelf. Then another. Outside, the light softened over the garden. Somewhere across town, my mother was dealing with the program she had refused to let exist without her story. Dad was answering questions I had not asked for him. Madison had a lease ending, and no automatic rescue plan. For the first time in my adult life, all three problems existed at once, and none of them were waiting in my hands. 6 weeks passed before the house stopped feeling like a command center. At first, every email notification still pulled my attention away from whatever I was doing. Every unfamiliar number made me wonder whether it belonged to a board member, a donor, or someone who had heard a version of the luncheon that ended with me standing at a microphone ruining my mother's life. Most of those calls never came. Life had the nerve to keep being ordinary. Clients still sent messy spreadsheets. One organization still confused projected outcomes with completed outcomes, despite 3 meetings explaining the difference. My rosemary plant still looked half dead no matter what I did to it. And the reading room slowly became the most used room in the house. The shelves filled first. Then a small rug appeared beneath the chair. A week later, I bought a floor lamp because the old guest room light was bright enough to interrogate someone under. Nothing in there could turn into a bed. That was deliberate. The first official update arrived through the hospital network's public partner notice. The transition was moving forward. Current transportation and temporary housing referrals would continue under the existing contract until the end of the cycle. The regional consortium would take over administration afterward. Staff members working directly on the program could apply to move into equivalent roles. No dramatic collapse. No building emptied overnight. No patients abandoned because my mother lost an argument. Services continued. That mattered more to me than I expected. A few days later, Carla Ruiz sent a formal notice confirming that the disputed description connected to my beneficiary record had been corrected in the materials relevant to the partner review. One sentence caught my attention. The Foundation's board had temporarily suspended Dad's financial certification authority while it reviewed prior reporting controls. I read that line twice, not because I wanted punishment, because, for the first time, his signature had created a consequence he could not wave away as conflict between women in his house. There was nothing about criminal charges, nothing about fraud findings, nothing about professional licensing. Dad had never been established as a licensed accountant, and I had no interest in inventing consequences simply because they sounded satisfying. He had been treasurer. He had certified records. So, the board had taken away his ability to certify more records while it reviewed what happened. That made sense. Madison's paid ambassador agreement was not renewed with the new program structure. I learned that from Madison herself. Her first message came on a Tuesday afternoon. My contract officially ends next month. There was no accusation after it. No question. I waited before answering. Okay. That was all. 10 minutes later, another message appeared. I know that sounds dramatic. I just thought you should know. I typed, "Thanks for telling me," then put the phone down. The urge to ask what she planned to do next was almost physical. Did she have enough for rent? Had she found a place? Was the divorce settlement moving? Had she updated her resume? Old habits rarely left because one good boundary speech embarrassed them. They waited. A week later, the phone buzzed while I was reading in the room that no longer belonged to hypothetical emergencies. Madison had sent a screenshot. A job listing. Community Outreach Coordinator for a Rehabilitation Network. Her message underneath read, "Do you think I could do this?" My thumb hovered over the keyboard. The fastest answer would have been to rewrite her resume, identify the hiring manager, suggest 3 changes to her application, and probably remind her to remove outdated speaking engagements. That answer lived in my muscles. Instead, I wrote, "Yes." Then added, "Write the application yourself. If you want me to proofread it after, I will." The typing indicator appeared, disappeared, returned. Finally. Okay. New argument. No complaint that I knew more about this stuff. No request to just fix it. 2 days later, she sent the draft. It was not great. It was also hers. I corrected 2 grammar errors and flagged 1 paragraph that sounded too much like a foundation brochure. Nothing else. When she thanked me, the feeling that followed was strange. Helping had always felt like taking weight. This felt more like holding a flashlight while someone else lifted their own box. Dad called that Friday. Do you have time to meet? About Mom? No. About Madison? No. I agreed to coffee the following morning. He arrived carrying no paperwork. That had become one of the first things I checked. We sat outside because the weather had finally cooled enough to make Florida remember autumn was technically possible. Dad stirred his coffee for a long time. Then he said, "The board asked me for a written response." I waited. They wanted to know what I verified before signing the annual certifications. What did you tell them? The truth. That word had become expensive in our conversations. He looked toward the parking lot. I verified financial totals. I didn't independently verify how some of the narrative outcomes were supported, including mine. Yes. No excuse followed immediately. That helped. They suspended my signing authority during the review, he said. I saw that in the notice. His eyes came back to me. You did? Carla sent the correction confirmation because my record was involved. He nodded. I resigned. That part was new. When? 3 days ago. Why? They could have restored authority later if the review was satisfied. He rubbed one palm across the edge of the table. I didn't want to sign another reporting cycle while pretending I didn't understand what happened. That was the closest he had come to saying it plainly. Not that he had invented the claim. Not that every report was knowingly false. That he had stopped allowing uncertainty to protect him. Dad looked down at his coffee. I kept thinking if the programs helped people, the rest was family mess. You signed your name where the family mess became a record. I know. His answer was immediate. Something in me shifted. Not forgiveness. Not restoration. Just the absence of resistance. He took a breath. I should have asked harder questions. Yes. I should have asked you. Yes. He winced slightly. Do you have to say yes that fast? Yes. For the first time in weeks, I smiled during a conversation with him. He almost did too. Then his expression settled. I want to have some kind of relationship with you. The old version of me would have made that easy for him. The old version would have heard vulnerability and immediately turned it into access. Instead, I folded my hands. No messages from Mom. He nodded. No asking me to solve Madison's money or housing problems. Another nod. No foundation business. Okay. No showing up at my house without asking. His mouth tightened, but he said, okay. And if you call me, call as yourself. Not because you're trying to negotiate something for everyone else. Dad looked at me for a long moment. I can try. That's enough for now. It was. Not a reunion. Not a clean slate. A smaller relationship with edges. On the drive home, I realized something that hurt more than it pleased me. Dad might never become the father who walked back toward the wrecked car in my memory. Nothing, I said now, could rewrite that scene. All I could decide was whether the man sitting across from me today got access to the woman I had become. That was different from erasing the past. The following week, Madison sent another message. Got an interview. A few minutes later, I didn't ask Mom to call anyone. That one made me put the phone down. Not because it deserved applause, because she knew what the old system would have done. A week later, another message arrived. I thought Mom built something for us. I'm starting to think she built us into it. The sentence sat on the screen for several seconds. There were a dozen things I could have said. You let her. You benefited. So did I, in different ways. Why did it take you this long? None of them would help. Finally, I wrote, I think that's something you need to keep thinking about. Her response came much later. Yeah. That was enough. No reconciliation montage followed. We did not suddenly become sisters who called every night. She still irritated me. I still did not trust her with everything. Sometimes healing looked less like closeness and more like stopping the machinery that made closeness impossible. Mom arrived on a Sunday afternoon. No call. No text. The doorbell rang while I was trimming basil in the kitchen. Through the glass beside the door, I saw her standing alone. No folder. No Dad. No Madison. For 1 second, my hand reached automatically toward the lock, then stopped. The boundary had been specific. No surprise visits. I opened the door but stayed in the doorway. You didn't call. I wanted to see you. You still needed to call. Her eyes moved past me into the hallway. I'm already here. That doesn't change the rule. Her mouth tightened. Can we talk? Here. On the porch. Yes. She looked as if the porch itself were an accusation. Still, she stayed. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Mom said, "The consortium starts taking referrals next month." I saw the notice. They took almost all the program staff. They applied for those positions. Her gaze sharpened. "You always have a correction ready. Only when the sentence needs one." She looked toward the front garden. "The foundation will continue." "I know. It will be smaller." I said nothing. That fact did not require a response. Finally, she turned back. Was keeping this house worth taking away everything I built? There it was. The house again. The easiest object to point at because walls were simpler than consent. The house was never what I was protecting. What does that even mean? It means you asked me to certify something false about my life. I asked you to recognize what the foundation did for this family. No. You asked me to turn that belief into documentation. Her jaw tightened. You could have handled this privately. The old phrase, private, where Mom spoke first. Where Dad softened the wording. Where Madison's need changed the subject. Where my refusal became attitude instead of evidence. Private was where you got to decide what happened. She stared at me. "Do you enjoy saying things like that?" No. That answer seemed to surprise her. "I don't enjoy any of this." "Then why keep punishing me?" I corrected my record. "You cost me the program. They gave you a path to keep it. The conditions were humiliating. That was your decision." She looked away. A car passed slowly on the street. Somewhere nearby, a lawn sprinkler clicked. The ordinary afternoon felt almost offensive beside the size of what we were saying. Mom turned back. "So that's it? What? I'm not your mother anymore." For years, that question would have terrified me. It still hurt, but pain no longer automatically made the answer hers. "You are my mother." Her face softened by a fraction. "That does not give you access to my house, my signature, or my version of what happened." The softness disappeared. "Rachel, if you want contact with me, there are conditions." "I'm your mother. I shouldn't need conditions." "Everyone needs conditions." She gave a short laugh without humor. "What are they?" "No foundation business." Her mouth tightened. "No messages through Dad." "Nothing." "No. Using Madison to pressure me." She looked toward the door. "No surprise visits." That one landed. "And you do not tell my crash story, as though your version belongs to me." Her eyes came back to mine. "It happened to all of us." "Yes. My part still belongs to me." For several seconds she said nothing. Then she asked, "Do you ever think about what I was supposed to do that day?" The highway opened inside me. Not as sharply as before. "Enough. I've thought about it for 10 years. Madison was bleeding." "I know. We didn't know how long help would take." "I know." "Then what do you want from me?" There was the question I had once wanted more than anything. An opening. Say it. Tell her you wanted her to come back. Tell her you wanted one sentence. Tell her you wanted to hear, "I should have stayed until help came." But that answer would still place my healing inside her mouth. So I told the truth. "I wanted you to understand why it hurt." She stared at me. "And now? Now I understand that you may never understand it the way I do." Her face closed. "That sounds convenient." "No, it's sad." For once, the word did not feel weak. Mom stepped backward. "I don't know who you've become." The old insult was hiding inside the sentence. This time, it missed. "I do." She walked down the path. At the gate, she turned. I almost expected another argument. Instead, she said, "Goodbye, Rachel." "Goodbye, Mom." No apology. No collapse. No sudden transformation. The gate closed behind her. For several minutes, I stayed on the porch. Then I went back inside and finished cutting basil. That evening, the framed newspaper article was still leaning against the wall in the reading room. The family that turned tragedy into hope. For weeks, I had known I did not want it displayed. Putting it away had felt different from throwing it away. So I removed the article from the frame carefully. No tearing. No dramatic gesture. The paper went into a document box with the original foundation records, my old email, and the correction packet. History. Not shrine. Not weapon. The empty frame stayed on the desk for another week. Then Naomi came over with 2 other friends to help me finish planting the back garden beds before dinner. One of them insisted on taking a photograph after we were done. My hair was frizzing from humidity. There was soil on one knee. Naomi was holding gardening gloves in one hand and a glass of lemonade in the other. Nobody looked polished. Nobody looked symbolic. When the picture came through the next day, I stared at it longer than expected. I was standing in the center. Not because anyone arranged me there. That was simply where I happened to be. The photo went into the frame. A month earlier, the same frame had held a public version of my survival. Now it held an ordinary Saturday. That felt more honest. The dinner became something we repeated. Nothing formal. Whoever was free came over. Someone brought bread. Someone else brought wine. Sometimes we ate outside. Sometimes the humidity drove us indoors. Dad called occasionally. Madison sent me the message when she got the outreach job. Got it. Then, before I could answer, I did it myself. I smiled at the screen. You did. She replied with a thumbs up. That was our relationship for the moment. Small, unfinished, real. One Friday evening, the doorbell rang, just as I was carrying plates toward the dining table. For 1 second, my body reacted before my mind did. A tiny tightening, an old expectation. Then I looked through the glass. Naomi stood outside with 2 friends, one carrying dessert and the other balancing a bowl under aluminum foil. The key was already in my hand. 10 years earlier, I had been trapped behind twisted metal, unable to open a door while the people I loved decided I could survive without them. Now the door opened easily. Because I owned it. Because my hand was on the lock. Because the people outside were there by invitation. Naomi lifted the dessert box. Are you planning to let us in, or should we eat this on the porch? I laughed. Come in. The door swung wider. They stepped past me into the house, talking over one another about dinner, traffic, and whether someone had forgotten ice. No folder, no demand, no one asking for a room, no one calling me strong because they needed me to surrender something. Before closing the door, I looked down at the key resting against my palm. For most of my life, people had called me strong when what they meant was convenient. The strange thing was, they had never been completely wrong. I could carry weight. I had simply spent too long believing that meant every weight handed to me belonged in my arms. It didn't. Some things were mine to carry. Some belonged to other people. And finally, I knew the difference. I closed the door behind the people I had chosen and went back to dinner.